So welcome to everybody. I'm just going to give it a few seconds to let all the many attendees who have registered for this event join. So bear with us just for a couple of seconds, if you would. Okay, let's get underway. Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this post-summit briefing and EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me this week, as always, are Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the European Policy Centre, and Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies. And our special guest joining us a little later on, Philipp Lausberg, Policy Analyst in the EPC's Europe's Political Economy Programme. In this special edition of Update, where we will be discussing the outcome of the first meeting of the European Political Community and the informal EU summit in Prague at the end of last week, as we consider how to deal with the upcoming winter of discontent. As always, totally interactive session, questions from me to our speakers, and I hope also from all of you. Your microphones are muted. If you want to ask a question when I open up the floor, click on the hand-shaped button on the right, and I will unmute you when the time comes. Or you can write your question. Please use the Q&A button, not the chat, the Q&A button, and please be as brief as possible. Twitter length or less would be good. Okay, let us dive in, and I'd like to start with the European Political Community, the first meeting, which took place last Thursday. Janis, in terms of what you thought it was going to be and what we knew about what this new community was intended to be and what actually happened at the meeting, what more have we learned about what sort of forum it will be, how effective it might be? What was your assessment of that first meeting?
Well, to some degree, it depends on how far you go back. When it was first proposed by Macron 9th of May, and then thereafter, there were a lot of discussions about what European political community would be about. And there were some who were thinking that it would be a grand endeavor, that it would probably deliver much more than at the end what we were expecting last week. Before Thursday, when it became clearer that the level of ambition is not at the level of what some had hoped that it would be, but that it was more about providing a forum for strategic dialogue, for bringing together at the end 44 heads of state and government leaders from all over Europe. So having more of an exchange, which can be both multilateral, also in smaller groupings, as we saw last week. It could also involve very small groups like the one we saw with respect to the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where there was a concrete effort to try to mediate between both sides and find the solutions. So we're seeing that this is more of a strategic dialogue and not more than that, but that in itself is of an added value. But the question still is there of what happens now after the first meeting took place, how concrete it will become in future, and how it will develop, or whether it will actually have a future, which is still in the air.
Let's come back on that in a moment. But Janis indicating there, I mean, sometimes the words forum for strategic dialogue, Fabian, can be a euphemism for a talking shop and something that serves little purpose. But could the very fact of there being this dialogue, i.e., does it matter if it remains only a talking shop? Does it still serve a useful purpose, or could it do so?
I think the difficulty with EPOC is that it's a bit like an organization looking for a purpose, and it's not even an organization. So we're talking about a summit, and to some extent, yes, it is a talking shop. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Also, talking shops are necessary. Maybe it's also important to consider having talking shops in I'm always reluctant to say post-COVID. It's not post-COVID, but certainly it's post some of the restrictions. So having leaders meet face-to-face, having these exchanges in person does make a difference. I think it is also important that we don't have a talking shop for certain issues to be discussed across Europe with all the countries involved. For some issues, for example, when we're talking about security, certain EU members will not be part of that conversation. For some issues, when we talk about certain parts of the European architecture, other countries will not be there. So I think it's important to have that inclusive forum and to also show that Europe is willing to take more responsibility for its own neighborhood. But then I think it still is a question of how do we develop that now into something which also has concrete outcomes, which can move certain debates forward. It's not enough to just talk. In the end, you also then have to make decisions. You have to take actions from that.
So would you, just to follow up on that, would your definition, Fabian, of success be that even if it remains a talking shop, it is clear and you can identify that it does in some areas lead to concrete actions, progress? Is that what you would be looking for?
Yes, I mean, I think we shouldn't expect too much too quickly. Clearly, it only has just started up. There's still a lot of positioning, of experimenting, of seeing where things are going to go. But in the end, yes, I think it is important to see that something also comes out of that, and that it is a more effective forum than a lot of the bilaterals which already are there, or some of the other fora where some of the European countries come together, like G7, but not all of them.
So it's got to demonstrate, Janis, some added value, both in terms of that forum for dialogue you talked about, but also in terms of concrete deliverables.
Yes, but let's not forget, this was a strong sign towards those who were not in the room, especially towards Moscow. It was delivering a sign towards Russia and those supporting Russia, which also means not only Russia, but also those who are in support or are not sure how they should treat Russia in future, of giving the sign of come together. And this in itself was a big purpose of this, at least first meeting. Now, we do not know how the situation regarding the war in Ukraine will develop, what it will be, what it will look like when they will come together the next time, which will be in Moldova, and whether there will be a necessity to do something at that moment also related to the conflict, to the war, in order to push forward certain positions or to push forward certain signs. Political signs are important these days. So that makes it very difficult also to make not only a prognosis, but also coming up with proposals of what should happen in future with respect to epoch, what should come out of it, because we do not know where we will find ourselves in 6 months' time, especially with a key reason why they got together this time, even if they often then say, well, this is having a strategic dialogue. We want to maybe also look into concrete projects in future. But at the end of the day, this was a clear signal towards Putin and those supporting him. And who knows where we will be in 6 months' time. This makes it even more complicated.
Just to follow up on that, President Zelensky of Ukraine addressed both this meeting and the informal summit, EU summit, the next day. Was there any attempt to achieve any concrete outcomes in terms of support for Ukraine? You said it was intended partly as a strong signal to Putin, but was support for Ukraine discussed at all? Did we get any signs that this forum could be useful in that area or not? Just to follow up, and then I'll come to you, Fabian. But
yeah,
Janis.
as I said, the meeting in itself was a sign. And the fact that Zelensky was there was obviously also a sign. But in terms of being very concrete, it wasn't. It was more concrete on the day after when they had the informal summit where Zelensky was saying, I need this, I need that, I need you to help me with certain issues, to live up to the promises which you've given. Whereas at the epoch, it was more of having him there, saying what he needs in terms of the political support, and the political support coming from this group of gathering of 44, rather than asking for concrete things. And let's not forget, this is a key element which we always need to have in mind, the heterogeneity of those in the room. Where we had the Hungarian prime minister, who obviously has a certain position when it comes to the conflict, to the war in Ukraine, and you had others who have totally different positions, but they were still in the same room. So even from Zelensky's point of view, from the point of view of Ukraine, one was careful not to ask for something which could not be delivered, because the worst thing would be is if the 24 would leave disunited, because if there would be a sign of disunity, this is what exactly would play into the hand of Putin and those supporting him. So, and I think that, and I'm sure that Zelensky was very aware of that. So it was not about asking for concrete things, getting a response from all 44, knowing how heterogeneous this bunch of leaders groupings is.
Mm-hmm. Fabian, on that point?
Yeah, it's. I think what they achieved is almost unity. Yes, we know that there are some creaks underneath the surface, but it was important to show that Europe is going to continue to stand behind Ukraine. So that really was the core message, and that was important for Ukraine. But certainly, it was also important as an internal message. To those who might potentially dissent, to say that there is agreement that this is the right course.
Fabian, can I stay with you for a moment on another issue? Much was made in the UK media and by many politicians of Liz Truss's last-minute decision to attend. Do you see, number one, her decision to go at all as significant, and number two, in particular, after some comments she made during the leadership campaign when asked whether she saw France as a friend or foe, she said the jury is still out, which caused something of a furore, although Macron replied very diplomatically. A lot of talk about a rapprochement between the British and the French, and you said, you know, this forum can be a forum also for some more bilateral discussions. How important was the British presence there, and how significant was the decision that the UK will host a future meeting of EPOC?
I think firstly, it's good that there seems to be a will now to move beyond the silly games of even putting into question whether France is a friend or foe, or Macron in particular. I mean, this is entirely unhelpful in a situation where regardless of what kind of conflicts there are in the EU-UK relationship, there is a reality of working together on a number of different issues, but certainly also on Ukraine, where it is extremely important that the UK is on board, given that it is still one of the hard security actors which matter in Europe. So I'm glad that we seem to be moving on from that rather childish behavior. I think there are also other signals from the UK which are positive, which are signaling that there's a willingness of the UK to finally return to what was in the political declaration, cooperation on issues of common interest. And if that can be achieved, I think that's already a great advance. But what is always in the background, and we shouldn't forget, is the Northern Ireland question. And unless we see real progress on the Northern Ireland Protocol and on the Northern Ireland Bill, which needs to be off the table at some point in time, I think we will always have a severe limitation.
And again, we've seen a change in tone. We've seen James Cleverly talking in more positive ways. We've seen the Commission talking more positively. Is it just a change in tone, or do we also, are you detecting underneath the surface genuine changes in terms of the substantive approach to the Northern Ireland Protocol?
It's more than a change in tone. We can see that already because it is coupled with a willingness to sit down again and talk, which we haven't done for a very long time. Whether that is also a willingness to then make the steps which are necessary, that is what will have to be proven in the next weeks. In the end, we should not forget that whenever we heard these positive comments, there was always the rider of, but yes, in the end, we still don't think that the Northern Ireland Protocol can be implemented in the way it is, unless the UK moves away from that unsustainable position. We are not going to make the progress which is needed.
Thank you. And linking this back, Janis, to the European political community, two things. I mentioned the UK has been chosen. I think it's Moldova, then Sweden, then the UK will host meetings. There was also a great endeavour, as I understand it, to make this community not look too EU-like, an insistence on no EU flags, a sort of reassurance this won't be dominated by the EU institutions, hence the choice of people to host it. How do you read, going back to my question earlier about what is this community, how do you see that discussion and how it evolved, and what do you read into the choices of countries that will host?
Well, first of all, the question is what it should not become, or what the actors believe it shouldn't become. It shouldn't become something which is institutionalized. It shouldn't become something which has a deep organized structure. Actually, it should not become an organization or an institution in itself. It remains and should remain a forum. This is what they have in mind, which also means that all those who were saying, well, we should use EPOC to foster enlargement, EU enlargement, to even link it, that there are some who have done that, who have linked it to EU institutional reform, or who said that this is about enhancing democracy. All these aspects and potential objectives are not on the cards, which, by the way, if they would be in the cards, they would require a differentiation among the 24, because not everyone wants to join the Union. Not everyone has a stake when it comes to the future of the European Union. Not anyone has an interest in enhancing democracy. You must even challenge how democratic some in the room are, obviously. So you have a heterogeneous group, which, because of its heterogeneity, cannot move in the direction of something which some had advocated, because that would require differentiation. And that would exactly undermine one of the main purposes of the entire initiative, which is to showcase unity and to showcase we're in this together. We're trying to promote XYZ, whatever the message of the moment will be. So this shows you what the limits of EPOC is, and that makes it then very difficult to move forward in future in making it something which at the end it will probably never become. Now the question is, will it then at some time die out and disappear? We've seen that in the past. Union for the Mediterranean, yes, it's a different context, it's also a different construct, but in the beginning there was euphoria, especially among those who are pushing it forward with it, but nothing actually came out of it. So we need to, I think one needs to be really realistic here.
Right. So Fabian, a danger of being over-ambitious, and if we're over-ambitious, as you pointed to the example of the Union for the Mediterranean, then that increases the chances it won't work, because if the expectations are too high and don't deliver, how does Europe get this right in terms of making sure it's meaningful, but not pushing it too far?
I think, firstly, we have had a good start in that context. It was important that the first meeting doesn't go wrong, that we, for example, don't have major disagreements between some of the actors, that some of the dialogue doesn't break down. So that's very important. I think it is important also for the next meetings to manage the agenda, to make sure that you're putting those things on which can realistically be addressed. But in the end, I think this is flying by sight. Every one of the meetings you will have to get right. And then if it continues to work, then you are building a certain momentum with it. But that will also be fragile. And of course, certain developments, in particular political developments, might well create a situation where that isn't feasible anymore. Just to go back very briefly on what we just talked about with the UK. If there is now a major fallout between the EU and the UK, which centers around Northern Ireland Protocol, which centers around potentially a trade war, then it's very unlikely that they're going to sit down together in EPOC and have a discussion which is completely divorced from that.
Janis, you wanted to jump in.
Just a small addition. As I said earlier, it very much, because let's not fool ourselves, without the war in Ukraine, the EPC, EPOC, as we should call it, would not have happened. So it really depends on where we will be in 6 months or 12 months, as I said. And I think that's something which we are not thinking enough now, is the potential function of EPOC in the context of the reconstruction of Ukraine and the reconstruction of the future security system of Europe. Now, you could say you have other fora where this will be discussed, but I think in terms of especially the reconstruction, and we're talking about multiple dimension of the reconstruction of Ukraine, once we will be in the phase where we will talk more about reconstruction. I think the heterogeneity of the 44 can even be an asset, because there will be different elements which will be needed, where some will be stronger, some will be less strong, some of them will be more important, and some more important in other areas. So I think having that dimension in mind is also important.
Okay, thank you very much. And just to point out, if you haven't read them already, 2 commentaries published by the EPC over the last week on the issue of the European political community, which you will notice we are calling by what we believe is its proper name, EPOC, because the EPC, European Policy Centre, was there first. I just point that out. One by Karina Stratulat on the beginning of the European political community, and one by Marta Muznik entitled The European Political Community, Time to Invest in the Power of Democracies. If you haven't read them, I do urge you to take a look. So let us move on. And as I mentioned earlier, we are being joined for this next part where we're going to look at what happened at the informal summit and what is happening more broadly with the European economy. Delighted to welcome Philipp Lausberg, who is a policy analyst in the Europe's Political Economy Programme. A very warm welcome to you, Philipp. Lovely to have you on Update. But let us first get a sense of what actually happened. Janis, in terms of energy, there was no agreement, except it would seem to agree that they really need to agree. Charles Michel, European Council President, said there is a common will for a common approach. I do love Mr. Michel's ways of dressing up, not agreeing on anything. What were the sticking points, and what are the prospects that they will get agreement on some form of action on energy prices at the formal summit later this month?
Well, first of all, the expectation management of the informal meeting, and it was an informal meeting, was already rather low. No one was expecting that they would come out with a consensus, with a compromise. The hope was that they would at least make a step towards the 21st of October, when we'll have the formal summit, where the hope is that some form of agreement can be found. And even that is not obviously sure. If you look into the differences between member states, and they are getting rather more and bigger than they had been, the gap among the 27 is huge on many different issues. It's obviously we're talking about the gas cap, but we also have issues related, for example, to linking Spain to Germany through a pipeline through France. So we have a whole bunch of issues which separate them. And now with the discussion which we're having, and I'm sure that we will talk about this in more detail, following the announcement of the German government to have the 200 billion package, which comes on top of another package, has created even more disunity among the 27. So we're in a very difficult situation. Nobody was expecting that they would reach a consensus now, and it's not even sure where we will find ourselves when we were speaking about the outcome of the European Council on the 21st of October.
But as I understand it, Fabian, we are expecting more Commission proposals in this area. As Janis was pointing out, this was an informal council, so no decisions expected. But was there a broader discussion of the whole cost of living crisis, the looming prospect of recession? And if not, why on earth not, given the gravity of the situation? And then I'll bring you in, Philipp, because I'd like to get your analysis of what the EU leaders did and didn't do. Fabian.
Yeah, I think the cost of living crisis clearly is always in the background now. And in many ways, on a political level, this is the bigger crisis. This is actually the crisis which really threatens individual governments in their electoral support, in their responsibility towards their own citizens. But I think what we are seeing now, and that was part of the broader discussion which was there, is that we're seeing increasingly member states taking action, and that action having implications for what is happening at the European level. And clearly the big elephant in the room this time was the German package and the implications or the perceived implications that has had for other countries. with Germany trying to reassure others that actually it wasn't that different from what other countries were doing. Other countries being rather strong on saying, no, it is very different and it is actually threatening European unity and the coherence of European markets. So this is exactly the kind of discussion which is inevitable when we're dealing with an issue like that, where we still have a large degree of national competence, where it's very important for national political decisions, but in the end, we also have a requirement to deal with this at the European level. So the Commission now has to square the circle, and it has to find a solution of how can we ensure that those national packages in some way coherently, or at least not contradicting each other, come together at the European level.
I want to come back on that in a moment. But in broad terms, Philipp, and just to point out, you have co-authored one commentary last month with George Rikeles on tackling the energy crisis, 8 considerations on how Europe can get through this winter. And last week, you published another one, the EU economy in crisis, can we learn from past mistakes? I'll come back to whether we can learn from past mistakes in a moment. But first, your reaction to the informal summit, the discussions, as we've heard, no formal decisions were expected anyway. But what did you make of the tone of the discussion, the substance discussion? What do they need to do to address this?
Well, of course, the summit has been a disappointment because we didn't get any progress on a concrete reduction of energy prices. First and foremost, of course, the gas price, which should be the absolute highest priority of the European Union right now to tackle all sorts of crises, whether we talk about a looming financial crisis that could happen when we have too high energy prices, but also state finances, and the entire crisis basically is based on the high energy price. And what we've seen on the summit is that there are essentially 3 or 4 suggestions for reducing the gas price. And one of them is a dynamic cap on import prices for gas. That's been floated especially by 15 mainly southern states. Germany is against that. We don't get didn't get any progress on that. Then there's a gas cap by subsidies to consumers or electricity providers. That's also something that's being discussed. That's something that Spain, for example, is doing already for a while. Germany wants to do it now as well with its 200 billion firepower. That's relatively easy to talk about that, but on a European level, nothing has agreed on. Yeah, it has been agreed on when it comes to that. Then there's also some suggestions to mix the 2 models. And of course, the idea of raising joint debt to cover these kind of gas subsidies to cap the price. I believe that, yeah, Scholz also, he proposed something which I believe is more or less a strategy to more or less destroy the discussion, in the sense that he suggested to come up with a buyers alliance with energy-hungry countries in Asia, which would make an agreement even more difficult. Nevertheless, I believe that, as we've seen in crises before, this kind of debate usually takes a while. The situation gets worse. But in the end, there is some sort of agreement. And if there's one thing we've learned about the EU, it's that it's failing forward, right? So first there's crisis, then there's chaos, and then there's suboptimal solutions. And as we've seen in the COVID crisis as well, first Germany, for example, injected a lot of money, just they've done now. They've got hugely criticized also when it came to mask production and so on. All the countries, or many, tried to go it alone. It didn't work out. But in the end stood the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So there is no reason why something like that shouldn't happen now again. I think the next summit will be decisive on that, because of course time is running out. the energy crisis is just too serious to wait another month or so. So I hope that something will be agreed on the next formal summit. And I have to say, I'm cautiously hopeful.
We'll come back on that. And I also want to come back on what you said in your commentary about avoiding repeating past mistakes. Don't forget, if you have any questions to our panel, you can either raise your hand or write in the Q&A box. Janis, in terms of will we get there, Philipp's saying they're cautiously optimistic that, as always with the EU, it takes time, but that the severity of the situation will lead to agreement at the next summit. Do you get the sense from the discussions last week that the severity of the situation is prompting EU leaders to look for European solutions, or, and we'll come back to the specific case of Germany and the 200 billion package in a moment, but broadly to look for national solutions to this, or indeed, do they really see a role for Europe in this?
Well, first of all, it will be a combination of different attempts to solve or deal with the energy crisis, which at different levels, and we're already seeing that. But Philipp is right. We're moving in a certain direction. If you look into when the discussion started about having a wholesale cap dynamic one, this was many months ago, and it has moved now into a situation where we're moving closer to trying to find a compromise. Now, will we find one within the next 10 to 11 days? I'm not sure, because if you look into the differences of opinions, they are still very big. And as I said earlier, they're rather getting bigger because there are new hot potatoes being added to the debate. So the Doppelwumms, as the German Chancellor called it, in terms with the 200 billion package, has made things even more complicated now. So yes, we're moving in a certain direction. I think at the end we will arrive at a compromise solution. Whether it will be in 10 days or 11, I'm not sure whether this will be the case. And you now have to square the circle. And squaring this circle is very complicated because it involves different issues. But you see that there are attempts also from those who are in certain camps to push the discussion forward. Philipp was mentioning different ideas which are floating out there. There's also this idea of having potentially a dynamic gas corridor, which includes countries which are among the 15, but not the entire group of the 15. Then you have all those who say, if you have a cap, this would undermine efforts to reduce demand. So you need also something in the package, in the overall compromise that will be found, which will make sure that you will have increasing pressure on member states to reduce gas demand. So that just shows you, and you could add even other elements to the complexity, that you need to really square a complex circle in order to get to a solution. And that might take longer than 10, 11 days.
Fabian, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really the question: are we making 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or is it the other way around? And I think at the moment we can't actually answer that. I mean, certainly the German package didn't help. It didn't get us into a more positive mode, but maybe that also puts political pressure on Berlin to find a way out of this. And I think this comes back to something we've discussed at the update before, which is the question of leadership. Who's going to actually pull this together? Who's going to put something on the table, which is a compromise position? Who's doing the shuttle diplomacy to get everyone on board? Because this is like the Euro crisis. You have to get all the leaders on board. You have to find that consensus.
Sorry to interrupt, but the Franco-German engine on this does not seem to be working particularly well. They were arguing about mid-cap, very different views on that. So are you worried that that leadership, which they traditionally provide, won't be there?
I think at the moment the signs are not good. As you said, they are arguing with each other. They have a very different approach. You can always say that also in the past, France and Germany often started at very different ends of the spectrum and then ended up somewhere in the middle, and that also helps then to bring others on board. But at the moment, at least, there doesn't also seem to be the political will to really find that middle ground where everyone can find themselves. And I think this is going to get worse because we haven't even started the discussion yet on what I see as probably the big missing element at the European level, which is the question of solidarity. It's the question of, once we get into distributional issues, into allocation issues, how do we deal with that? And I think this is going to become much, much more acute as we're entering the season when it will matter. And I think what we are going to see, unless we find a way of coming together rather quickly, is that some parts of Europe will be cold and hungry, and they will watch other parts who are not. And if that happens, we really have a major political problem.
Thank you. Philipp, just wanting to come back on your commentary that I mentioned earlier about can we learn from past mistakes? How great a risk is there that the looming recession, that all of this leads to a new banking crisis or a new sovereign debt crisis of the types we saw in 2008 and then 2010 to 2015? What needs to be done? What do you argue for to make sure that does not happen?
Well, indeed, for example, the Systemic Risk Board, Financial Systemic Risk Board has warned that there is a risk to systemic financial stability. And also the OECD has floated a similar paper. So the problem at the moment is that you have businesses that are fighting with very high energy prices. And at the same time, their lending conditions are getting worse with rising interest rates by the ECB. So the danger is that a lot of these companies at some point could get bankrupt. And that, again, would lead to a situation where they couldn't repay their loans. And that, of course, would then also endanger banks. Now, since the last euro crisis, there have been a few reforms. So they have a centralized supervisory system around the ECB as part of the banking union that has led us to have much higher buffers on cash, but also on capital. That has made the banking system generally more resilient. However, if we get to a point where we have a lot of non-performing loans from companies that are failing, then we don't have a very strong system to actually resolve banks that might collapse because of that. So there is a common resolution mechanism, but the funding behind it is relatively limited. There's only 60 billion in the resolution fund, in the European Resolution Fund, and there's another 60 billion as a backstop. And that's not even enough to possibly orderly resolve one single systemic bank. So if we get to that point, then we could really get into very deep problems, and something like the financial crisis that would spread by contagion across Europe could become a reality. And of course, that would also mean that member states would have to step in again and bail out. And that was one of the reasons for the sovereign debt crisis. So it has to be a priority to finish the banking union, to basically provide more resolution funding, to provide a bigger fiscal backstop so that banks will not just default disorderly. And we would really need to get ahead also with the capital markets union, because the problem in Europe is that 80% of finance is based on banks. And in the US, there's much more equity financing, for example, which is much less crisis prone. So to build deeper capital markets in Europe is definitely one other way ahead to tackle that problem. When it comes to sovereign debt, well, we also see that yields for sovereign debt, especially in southern member states, are rising. Italy is at something like 4.5, 4.6%. Of course, it's nothing compared to 17% or something Greece was in 2012, but the direction clearly is going upwards. The spread is also rising again, and of course, interest rates are rising due to the interest rate hike of the ECB, Indeed. Which makes it harder for indebted countries to pay back their debt. And of course, we have all the financing to fight the the cost of living crisis. So there is definitely a mixture there that could turn out quite dangerous. What we can do against that? Well, I mean,
briefly, if you would, Philipp.
Sorry.
Briefly, if you would.
Yes, very briefly. I mean, we've learned from the past crisis that we need mainly two things. One is a strong fiscal backstop, and that has been provided by the Recovery Fund in sort of the COVID crisis. We luckily have still 650 billion, which haven't been dispersed yet. So there is some firepower left from that big fund that we might be able to use also during the current crisis. And then we definitely need more credible and more effective fiscal rules, because financial markets, sovereign debt markets, they don't trust in the fiscal framework we have now, because member states keep breaking it. So if
Janis,
we can
I know
build
you want
some sort of stability there, that would be good.
Okay. Janis, I know you want to come in, a very brief one if you would, because I'd like to come back to the Germany issue in a moment. And I also want to come back, I want to pick up on what Philipp was talking about, Italy and sovereign debt. But Janis.
I had something on the German issue. So if you want me to start with that, that would fit.
No, add whatever you wanted to add to Philipp.
Okay, I wanted to, no, it refers to this idea which is now out there, that in some ways the current situation resembles what we had in the first months of 2020 during the COVID-19 crisis. And that this could potentially, that the 200 billion could undermine the single market, could lead to fragmentation, so that you would have an argument towards also Berlin to go forward to agree to something more substantial at the European level, maybe even a new debt finance instrument. So this is the logic which is now being put on the table. But I think that one needs to be careful in making this comparison. For one, it's the politics which is different. The German coalition is a coalition which is very complex. I'm not sure that they would be ready to do something which the then coalition did. Scholz is not as strong as Merkel was at the time. And now Germany is structurally hit by the current crisis. It's the basic German economic model which has taken a hit because of the energy prices. And let's not forget that there is a deep-rooted skepticism, even distrust vis-a-vis Berlin, because of the nature of this crisis and how much of a responsibility the Germans have, that there is no trust that they will be ready to show solidarity to others. So the situation is not the same as it was in May 2020, when there was an agreement between Paris and Berlin, which actually led to Next Generation EU. And the last point is just also looking to the back, and I'm going to be very short. I think one of the lessons we should have learned, especially during the Euro crisis, is that when the crisis gets worse, when there's a domino effect, there's a first and a second domino. And in the past, we did not then immediately react. We waited too long in addressing the problem in one country. And this is, I think, is a major lesson we should take from the past. In case there's a deteriorating situation along the lines of what Philipp was describing, it will start in one or the other country, and you need to fight back very quickly. Whatever the means is you have at your disposal, and I think that the ECB's means are less than it was some years ago, so it will be something which has to be member state driven.
Thank you. I want to take a question from the audience, but Fabian, you wanted to come on this, and let's touch on Germany again, because we're talking about this 200 billion euro package, which some senior diplomats have said really does risk fracturing the single market by giving German firms an unfair advantage and sparking a subsidy race. You said the Commission has to square the circle. What does it have to do?
Let me just come back to the question of recession first, because I think it's important that we recognize, firstly, that whatever we do now, our leaders have to communicate to populations that there are limits to what governments can do, and that this attack by Russia also means that there will be a loss of welfare in Europe. That is inevitable. It is not something which we can in some way turn around. It's not something which is also a temporary blip which we can bridge over. This is a structural challenge which we will have to deal with, and it will mean that we have to make sacrifices. That's a very difficult message, but I think the earlier leaders give that message, the better. Because if people still have the illusion that somehow we can get through this without feeling anything ourselves, they will be very much disappointed. And I think the second point for me is, and that's the only time when I will say this, I think Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng had a point. Maybe they didn't realize it, but they had a point in the sense that they have demonstrated how difficult it is to deal with a recession at a time of high inflation, because it means that your usual fiscal and monetary policy interventions don't work in the way you want them to work. You can't just spend more money. You can't just have loose monetary policy, because through interest rates, through inflation, that then has a negative impact. And as we have seen in the UK, it can cancel out completely what you're trying to achieve. So we really have a challenge about what works in this kind of situation. How do you actually address this recession which is looming? So I think that's something where we really have to have more discussion about what are actually effective mechanisms in that kind of situation.
Just going back to expectations of the EU level, one of our audience asked, beyond the state level, do we know what solutions European citizens want? How can we explain the conflicts between member states while all citizens probably want the same thing, a cap on energy prices? How do you think European citizens will react to this winter and the current lack of common decisions, and what impact could this crisis have on all Europeans? So we say, well, it was an informal summit, we didn't expect them to reach agreement, it's very difficult, it will take time. But what are citizens going to make of that? And do you think they're looking to Europe to help to provide the answers here? Fabian, come back to you on that one.
I'll start with it, but I think the key thing here is, I think citizens, of course, want effective action, and they don't much care whether that is at the national level or at the European level. And certainly they don't have much patience for these kind of discussions where they see that essentially there is no unity, there's no common approach. But the reality is it's not that simple. If we have an energy cap price of whatever form, what happens if we don't have sufficient supply? So you might have some form of rationing, you might have some form of allocation. You then have to ask the question, how do you do that across borders? What parts of the population get preferential treatment? How much do we focus on vulnerable rather than the population as a whole? How much do we focus on vulnerable across border rather than on vulnerable within our own country? So it is a very complex and a very difficult situation. It's not helped by European disunity, but certainly there are no easy answers either. So we have to also explain more to citizens what kind of challenges we are facing, and that all of the actions we are taking have trade-offs, they have negative impacts we also have to take into account, and that there's no easy way out of this. But I think it also has to be a thread, and that's coming back to what I was saying before. People have to feel it's fair. They have to feel that there's a consideration for the distributional effects. They have to feel that, for example, companies which make enormous amounts of supernormal profit in a situation like that have to also be taken into consideration, and that we have some form of windfall tax.
Sure. Let me bring this away from the summit and to another question I just wanted to raise with you, because since our last update, Janis, we have seen elections in Sweden and in Italy. Italy, most strikingly, that victory for the centre-right coalition led by Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy, a right-wing popular party. Populist party. We've also seen the far-right Sweden Democrats doing incredibly well, second biggest force, 20% of the vote. Philipp, I want to come to you about what impact that might have in terms of sovereign debt, because you alluded to it earlier. But Janis, in broad terms, and linking it to the question from our audience about citizens' expectations, are we seeing in this The result, if those citizens do not perceive, as Fabian says, that it's fair, do not perceive that everything possible is being done to help them, and what could the consequences for the EU be of these new parties in government and potentially in government?
Now, I know that you want a short answer, given also the time we are at. And there is no short answer because we see that the situation in countries are very different. You were alluding, obviously, to Sweden and Italy. There are different reasons why certain parties have done well during in these elections. But if you look at the European dimension, I think something is clear with now having the new Italian government in place. I take this as an example in one of the biggest EU countries. It makes it more difficult to overcome the dilemma which we're having, which is between unity and ambition. On the one hand, we want 27 to stick together as much as possible, which is also important because at the end of the day, and I think we're forgetting this a bit because we're now so much talking about the internal dimension when it comes to cost of living, energy crisis. At the end of the day, our major problem, which we now have, is the war in Ukraine and how we deal with that. And that's where we want to show unity. At the same time, we also want to be ambitious in the way how we react to the crisis and how we find a common position when it comes to some of the more fundamental questions we need to tackle. So we need to find a balance between unity and ambition. And if you have parties like the ones now in government or getting in control in Italy, that makes it much more difficult because it strengthens potentially those who are not seeking more ambitious results at the European level. And that leads to then citizens being unhappy with what is happening or not happening at the European level, and whether then that is helping or not helping also the member states to deliver on what people's concerns are. So you see how all these things are interlinked. And actually, I do not know where we will end at the end of the day. Because I think the implication of the question which was addressed earlier is, will others so-called populist forces also have successes in member states? And I don't think that the verdict is still out. There's a good chance that that might be the case, but we're not sure. During the COVID-19 crisis, it was not the case that the populists were the ones who were winning out of that crisis. Now you could say the nature of this crisis is different, and thus also the potential effects on it in the member states. But I'm just saying that the verdict is not out, and there's still a lot you can do as member states, but also collectively at EU level. And I hope that those who are not allowing certain decisions to be taken will understand that, which includes also Berlin.
Thank you very much, Fabian. I know you want to come in, but I wanted to come to Philipp because you're talking there about how do we deal with the lack of unity when there are countries that don't want to move forward and find these solutions. But Philipp, you were alluding earlier to Italy, yields, and the risk of another sovereign debt crisis. How significant, how great is the risk that this new Italian government could prompt a new crisis, and more broadly, this political turmoil where we see far-right parties, well, in some cases, we have to say, not doing as well as was expected in some countries, but in others doing much better, perhaps, than was expected. How do you see the impact of all of this on financial markets, on the risk of another sovereign debt crisis?
Well, I do see that there's a risk coming from right-wing government that also disturbs financial and sovereign debt markets and takes away trust. But I think this also cuts both ways, right? So on the one hand, we see that Italian yields for sovereign bonds, they have been rising. And I think that the election of the right-wing government has played a role in that. But on the other hand, we also see that these right-wing governments are actually interested in trying to convince the markets that they're actually not that dangerous. So we've seen Meloni trying to appoint the ECB's Panetta as finance chief of the finance ministry in Italy, to basically put in place a technocrat, a trusted technocrat that creates trust in the markets, and certainly someone who is not going to go all the way into some sort of crazy spending spree that some would expect from these kind of populist governments. Well, and Panetta, he said no, but still, and we see that there is the will to, and also the knowledge there that it's absolutely clear that he cannot be successful in government without going somehow by some sort of EU law, rules and not to do something outrageous. So in that sense, I think this I don't think that the risk is too high for now, at least from the signals we've got so far.
Thank you. Fabian, you wanted to come back in, I think in reaction to something Janis said.
Just a very brief point on populists. I think we should bear in mind that the populists don't necessarily have to win to be successful, because the key thing here is the rhetoric and I think the reality which we're seeing in more and more countries, which is essentially my country first, because the populists are at our heels, and if I don't prioritize our own citizens, they will win. So it is already creating the logic of fragmentation, of doing things alone rather than doing things together. And I think that is the really fatal influence, rather more important actually than an electoral success for a right-wing party, because this really undermines our overall cooperation.
Absolutely. We are almost out of time, and I just want to ask you, bearing in mind that the next time we meet for an EPC update, it will be after the next summit, and we've talked about the importance of that summit, a formal one, so formal decisions can be taken. Fabian, then Philipp, and then Janis, for each of you, looking ahead to that informal summit, what for you will be the most important issue of all the range of issues we've talked about today for them to discuss, and what will they need to do? I'm afraid it's 1 minute each. Fabian, most important issues, what do they need to do? What will make us say at our next update, that was the summit we needed to have at this moment?
Agreement on gas prices and putting into place at least the discussion on a solidarity mechanism.
Thank you very much. Philipp?
I agree, definitely agreement on reducing gas prices. And arriving at a common European approach in doing so to end nation states going alone, basically.
Thank you very much. Janis, you have the last word.
I think we're going to see that obviously the energy crisis, cost of living issues will be high on the agenda. I hope that they will be getting closer to being able to square the circle. I don't see that this is 100% sure. I have my severe doubts. I think that we will see that they will have to be discussing more Ukraine, because if you see what is happening as we speak, we see an escalation of the situation. And I would expect that this will not stop in the upcoming days. So if the EU leaders find themselves at the summit on Thursday, Friday next week, they will have to address that even more. What we will not be discussing, and I think that is a problem we're having and we're seeing in today's inaction or action, is that we're not dealing with some of the hot potatoes, the things that actually divide us, that go very deep. And that is making it problematic to find the solutions now. And in addition to what Fabian said when he was talking about my first, I think the phenomenon which we're increasingly seeing is me first. And me first starts at the individual level, at the family level, at the regional, the local, and the member state level. And that is playing into the hands of the my country comes first, and it's increasing the national focus. And at the European level, we don't need more national focus. We need an attempt to find common solutions. And that is becoming not easier, but it's becoming more difficult as time progresses, it seems.
Thank you very much. And we will, of course, come back to all these issues at our next EPC update, which will also be combined with a post-summit briefing, as this one was. Thank you so much to all of you, particularly to Philipp, for joining us today. Great to have your insights, Philipp. Really appreciate it. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Just to remind you of those commentaries that I mentioned on the energy crisis and the economy, which Philipp has authored and co-authored, and those two on the European political community. Please do look out for them. It only remains for me to wish you all a pleasant rest of the day and see you next time, I hope. Bye-bye.
Bye.